Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the International Growth Center's online event, The Impact of COVID-19 on Informal and Migrant Workers in India. I'm Shahid Wazir Ali, Head of the Research Program at the IGC, and I will moderate today's session. Now, before we get started, let's review a few quick housekeeping items. So all attendees have been muted to minimize background noise. So if you have a question during the presentation, please type them into the Q&A box, which you can access at the bottom of your screen. Now, we're going to have a time later on to answer questions, so keep them coming, and we will direct them to members of the panel in about 30 to 40 minutes. And please make sure to include your full name and organizational affiliation. So we're recording today's session, and a video and audio recording will also be made available on IGC's website and other social media platforms. I'd also like to point out that there will be a brief survey immediately following today's presentation. So please take a minute to fill that out later on, as your feedback is really important to us. As you can see on the panel, we're missing Jean Drez, but he's trying to connect. He's having a bit of problem in Ranchi, but we're hoping that he'll be able to connect very soon. And also please feel free to contribute to the conversation online by using hashtag IGC COVID-19. So the reason why IGC is convening this discussion today: India, the world's second most populous country, still has relatively few cases of COVID-19 compared to the US and Europe, for example, but has seen cases and deaths rise dramatically in recent days, especially in some states like Maharashtra, Delhi, Gujarat, and Tamil Nadu. On the 24th of March, 6 weeks ago, the Indian government ordered a full national lockdown. India was quick to close its international borders and enforce a series of containment measures, which had been initially praised as tough but timely. However, the lockdown was announced with barely 4 hours' notice. The relief package, which is essentially top-ups of food and cash transfers on existing programs, was announced a few days after the lockdown. So it's been widely criticized as not being enough. Yesterday, the Indian government announced a headline-grabbing $260 billion economic stimulus package. Welcome news, obviously, but there's almost no detail on what it is including. So much of this will, I think, include monetary stimulus by central bank or bailouts to specific industrial sectors, but it's unclear how much will be dedicated to social protection at this stage. Now, millions of people, especially migrant and informal sector workers, were immediately left jobless at the announcement of the lockdown, with enough savings to possibly feed themselves for a week or 2 weeks at the most. Many of them, likely tens of millions, do not have ration cards to access food aid. All of this prompted a mass exodus of people, fleeing cities to go back to their villages on foot, traveling hundreds of kilometers in above 40-degree heat. Many more remained trapped in cities as interstate trains and buses came to a halt. Now, we have no reliable account of the number who are hungry, malnourished, or dying. Now, I want to quickly bring your attention to some figures. A leading consultancy in India is conducting a large 18,000 household survey on the economic impacts of COVID-19 across 10 states. Now, while the results are preliminary, they show that on average, poor households lost 60% of their income in April. 20% have already run out of all money and supplies, and a further 60% will run out within the next 2 weeks, despite government relief. Only 6% have received some form of private support from relatives or NGOs. Now, those are a lot of figures to get our heads around. But if you assume that there are more than 300 million extreme poor in India, and you just do the basic math, we're talking about a very, very large crisis. Perhaps the largest amongst all countries, one that will disproportionately affect the poor. So while there is some evidence also to show that the lockdown has slowed the transmission rate of the virus, it has obviously come at an enormous cost. So this discussion will be about what more India needs to do to protect its vulnerable population: migrants, informal workers, and the elderly. So we're having to aim to have an interactive event. I will start with a general discussion, and then I'll offer you a chance to ask your own questions. So keep them coming in the Q&A box. I'm also assisted by my colleagues who will be able to respond to your queries if you have any issues. So I'd like to welcome our distinguished panelists here to tackle this topic. Purnima Menon, who is a senior research fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute. Purnima leads IFPRI's South Asia Nutrition's program, and she's written extensively on maternal and child nutrition in India. Welcome, Purnima. Farzana Afridi, who is an associate professor of economics at the Indian Statistical Institute in Delhi. She's also lead academic for the IGC. Excuse me. Farzana's work spans a variety of areas, labor economics, gender, education, political economy. And she also just conducted one of India's first surveys on the economic impacts of the lockdown, which we'll get to soon. And Jean Drez, who I do not see on as yet, but I'll introduce him anyway in case he hops on. Jean Drez is an honorary professor at Delhi School of Economics, visiting professor at Ranchi University. John has contributed so much to policy debate in India and has really shifted the needle on many issues dealing with poverty. And his recent work has mainly focused on cash and food transfers and on the NREGA program. So welcome to all of you.
Thank you. Thank you, Shahid.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'll start with a general question to all of you, and then we can dig deeper into the issues. So knowing what we now know, in terms of the economic and social consequences and the spread of the virus, what do you think India could have done differently? Either one of you could start.
I think we were correct, the government was correct in being cautious in the sense of announcing the lockdown, given the spread in the US and the Europe and the huge burden it would have entailed on the public health system. But I think the one thing, with hindsight, that we could have done better was to prepare for the lockdown to ensure that the vulnerable were protected, that they would be able to access essentials. And I think the second thing that was important was that once we were in lockdown, we still don't have an exit strategy, which would have involved and should have involved an increase in the testing rates for the virus.
Purnima, any thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think
you're on mute.
I think in this situation, what would have been needed is a great deal of anticipatory analysis. Sort of working through, there was time. Because one had seen what had happened in China, one had seen what kinds of things needed to be put in place if you were going for a sort of scale population lockdown. One was seeing what needed to have been done in the health system, but specifically from the perspective of lockdown, to anticipate which are the clusters of the population that which are the clusters of the population that would have been likely to suffer more? I don't think this should have been a mystery necessarily. So I think, just really thinking through pathways through which people would have been affected by the lockdown and which people would have been the worst affected, and then working back from there to say, what is it we need to put in place as we move into the lockdown or even very quickly into the lockdown. It's a tough situation though, because if, I'm also an epidemiologist and someone who works in public health and health systems, and we've never seen anything like this in the world of health. Never. This is just a virus to beat all viruses in terms of, transmissibility, in terms of the strange things it seems to be doing in clinical conditions, in terms of the ways in which it's stressing health systems. So it's only, in a sense, was natural that governments would want to and need to act quickly. But I just really feel like, anticipatory analysis, also looking at what the first states in India to have seen the virus. I mean, Kerala put in place a lot of protection mechanisms and health system prep early. And we don't know what discussions happened, as leading up to the lockdown, obviously. So we don't know the extent to which there was anticipatory analysis, but it certainly wasn't out in public. So, I think thinking about the people who are going to be worst affected is really important in situations like this. And so I think we may not have seen the things that we saw in terms of the distress if people who would be worst affected were sort of held in the front of the planning, perhaps.
Absolutely. Jean, are you on? Trying to figure out whether Jean Dress can hear us. I think I can see him on. Okay, we'll move on and hopefully he can connect. So another question to you both, perhaps Farzana, you can take this because you recently conducted that survey in Delhi. So do we know more at this stage about the impact of the crisis on livelihoods? Farzana,
Yeah,
what did your survey tell us?
sure. Yeah, so I think what is really, what we're seeing across the board from various surveys, and some of which were able to take off very quickly as soon as the lockdown was announced, is that there is a near consensus that there's been a massive shock to employment and to livelihoods. So for example, our survey was in urban areas of Delhi, which are the industrial areas, and most of these are slums and resettlement colonies. So people who've been resettled from Jhuggi Jhopri. So essentially the urban poor. And up to 90% of these people report not having work for even a single day, given that majority of them are either self-employed in petty businesses, or they are casual daily wage earners. That means that they're foregoing earnings every day, so they're not salaried employees. So that's number one. And number two is that what we also see is that the proportion who are reporting not receiving their full salary for March, and obviously they wouldn't have received any earnings whatsoever in April, has increased as the lockdown has progressed. So their initial perceptions might have been that this is a transitory shock or the loss of work is transitory. But as the lockdown has persisted and the economic activities have shut down, people now are perceiving this more as a permanent reduction in income. So this is a huge shock to demand. And if we are to start the economy again, then it requires not only protecting those who are vulnerable in terms of this severe income shock that they are facing, but also doing this in the sense of providing them the cash transfers as well as in-kind transfers, because there's no one way of protecting these vulnerable people. The second interesting thing that we found was that along with this shock that they're getting to their income, of course, comes a lot of stress. So there is a lot of emotional stress, there's depression, there's anxiety, and that could have potential repercussions on productivity, even as we go further into, restarting the economy, rejigging the economy in terms of the productivity of these workers. So all of this anxiety is going to, I think, is what we are seeing also some of it spill over in the sense of, the migrants wanting to move back to the rural areas. So even though the majority of our respondents are in Delhi, the ones that we were surveying, weren't seasonal migrants, so they're not temporary migrants, they've been residing in Delhi for some time, there's still about 5% of our sample which was moving back to the rural areas. So what is really worrying is that if the economic activity doesn't pick up, and these medium short-term shocks to income and earnings would have these longer-term implications in terms of reducing the supply of labor in urban areas, leading to excess supply of labor in rural areas where agriculture does not necessarily have the capacity to absorb all that labor. So all of this requires a very comprehensive long-term strategy in order to sort of address this misallocation of labor and to protect the vulnerable and ensure that we are able to get the migrants back to the urban areas. So I think that is, one needs a longer term perspective, but at the same time, one has to start now, today, in terms of attacking these issues from the policy perspective.
Shahid, you're on mute.
Shahid, we can't hear you.
Yeah, sorry, I was on mute. So you had mentioned that because of the excess labor in rural areas, we need to get migrants back into urban areas to balance out the economy. What policy options does the government have to do that? Especially when trust has been eroded so massively, migrants would be reluctant to come back to urban areas anytime soon, even though businesses and industry want them back here. Maybe not now, but in 6 months from now. So, what can government do to kind of solve that issue?
Right. I think that's something that they have to grapple with. So number one thing is, as the migrants are moving back to rural areas, we need to provide them social protection in the rural areas itself. And in this, Manrega jobs can play a massive role. So there is, since there is not going to be that much work available in agriculture to be able to absorb everybody. Now, coming back to the urban areas, I think the number one concern that these migrants, both seasonal as well as permanent migrants, have is this perception that this is an urban disease, that it is primarily it's spreading in urban areas, and so we can escape it if we go to rural areas. So I think there is some amount of lack of communication in terms of exactly what this disease is, and the communication that the mortality rates of this disease are not as high as the public perceives it to be. So, generally this concept that it is like an achut ki bimari that we have in India. So if you're going to get it, then you're going to suffer for, potentially a very, very long time in terms of engaging with society and being able to move around in social circles and so on. So what exactly is this disease? What is the death rate for this disease? How can we prevent it from, how can we prevent ourselves from contracting it? And what is interesting that we saw in our survey was that there is a decline in the community's practices of the safe health, such as social distancing, washing hands frequently, and not having social gatherings. So compared to those respondents whom we interviewed earlier on in the lockdown, the ones who were interviewed later on, and the timing of the interview is random, so it basically tells us what is the difference in the length of the exposure to the number of days of the lockdown. Those who were interviewed later report less of avoiding social gatherings. They are more likely to not wash their hands frequently or observe people around them not doing that, which again is telling you that there has to be a consistent message going, a very, very well thought out government communication program, which really lays down what this disease is about. And this concern that it is an urban disease and unlikely to occur in rural areas be one of the main reasons why it would be very hard to get the migrants back to urban areas. Besides, of course, the fact that they need to get social protection when they come back, because it is going to take time for economic activity to pick up. And while they are coming back and while they're being incentivized to come back, they need to be provided cash transfers and in-kind transfers, ensured safe living conditions and hygienic living conditions as they come back. And I think that's really essential.
Yeah. So Purnima, how worried are you that the disease will spread to rural areas? Question one. And two, what can the government do to get its messaging right about the disease?
Yeah, I mean, both are really, really important questions, because it's, like I said earlier, it's not a pretty disease. And what we're seeing already in India is a very different death rates depending on which city you're in. So right now in West Bengal, the death rate, which of course everything is affected by the testing denominators and things like that, but the case fatality rate in West Bengal is really high. Whereas the case fatality in Kerala is very, very low right now. So in a sense, how the human body is responding to this disease and how badly off you're likely to be is quite strongly determined also by the quality of the health system you encounter if you get sick with it. And there lies part of the crux, right? I am very worried about rural transmission because the disease is highly transmissible. There's absolutely no doubt about that. The fact that you're seeing re-emergence of cases in countries where you felt like, okay, they really have this under control. The fact, I mean, there's amazing analytic work, for example, from China, where they were following the massive outmigration that happened from Wuhan using mobile phone data. And it just showed again how quickly the disease moved, with the people who moved out of the centers. Now, we don't know the extent to which the migrant population that left the cities was already infected or not. If the infection rate was low, then perhaps with some of the containment and other things, you'll have lower transmissibility in rural areas. But we don't know that. What we do know about this virus is it's moving really fast. And it's, it's especially problematic because of the asymptomatic transmission. And that's what makes the public health communication so important. We are not used to it. We, as human beings, you're used to staying away from people when they're sick. But here we have transmission happening among people or from people who are potentially look just fine. And that's where the public health communication remains critical. People's ability to respond to that public health communication is really different, right? I mean, it is going to be near impossible to maintain the kind of physical distance that one is being advised to do the kind of hand washing expected to do. In contexts where people don't have the basic wherewithal in terms of the infrastructure of your homes or water and sanitation. And those are the other elements of rural transmissibility that are worrisome. The fact that you don't have, either homes where people can isolate if they get mildly sick, or the fact that you don't have a lot of the water sanitation infrastructure is still really compromised. So yes, I am worried about rural transmissibility. I think the only thing one can do in a public health sense there is to keep the communications up, to keep it really strong, but also to prepare for the fact that if you do have outbreaks, even in those areas, that the health system is able to actually do the isolation and quarantining by establishing, local facilities. People aren't going to be able to do that quite effectively at home in situations where you don't have the infrastructure. So yeah, from a public health perspective, definitely concerned. It's a very difficult disease to engage people around, also because the time frame is so uncertain. I mean, even people with wherewithal in sort of wealthier urban areas, everyone is going to tire of this at some point, and then the risks will accumulate for people again. And we're seeing that. You're seeing that with resurgences in South Korea. You're seeing that with the way the cases are moving in the West as well. So this is going to be a long haul. Lots to be concerned about from the health perspective as well.
Farzana, could you just turn your video on and off?
I'm not able to do anything because my screen is frozen.
Okay.
So I'm not able to mute, I'm not able to stop video, I'm not able to do anything. I don't know if I'll have to leave the meeting and get back in, I think.
You want to try that?
Yeah, but I can't even click on leave meeting. It's just completely frozen. Let me try to, I'll have to say escape or something. I don't know what to do. Let me see. It's just my laptop is frozen.
Okay. I guess audio is good. Audio is good. But at the risk of losing you completely, we'll stick with audio.
Yeah. Okay, sorry about that.
Just following up on what you just said, Purnima, can India learn anything from other Asian countries on how they've communicated about the virus?
I think India can learn from within India. There are, you have at least one state that's being recognized, not just in India, but also globally for, their efforts at flattening the curve, at keeping the fatality rate really low. In our other work in nutrition, we've also been doing some sort of state level success cases in the context of India itself. And those are more sort of more valuable in a sense than looking to contexts that are so completely different. I do think that the challenge though, and there was some early writing about health systems in India that highlighted this. You cannot prepare for an emergency in the emergency. So I think what we're going to see within India is states that had already reasonably well-functioning health and health systems and social safety net programs, where even some of the poor states have had health systems that have been delivering quite well in the last 10 years or so, Chhattisgarh, et cetera. They've had social safety net programs that have been working better than in other poor states. So more likely than not, I think what we're going to see is that states that had existing systems already sort of working is where we're going to start to see better responses. But I think, the value of investing in learning exercises within this context is that we can learn from what is happening already within India. There's a lot of innovation happening. There's a lot of adaptation happening. And it's quite important that the lesson building be running alongside in a fairly serious way and a systematic way. I don't think it's enough to just have media reports on, say what, Kerala is doing or what Chennai is doing or what Bangalore is doing or, what Delhi is doing. I think you need sort of a more thorough, we need the health systems researchers to get in there. We need the, the economists to get in there. We need the sociologists to get in there. Because there's a lot of different things that are having to be dealt with, and different states and different systems kind of dealing with those differently. There are states that have recognized that the psychosocial burden is going to be substantial. They're, putting in place counseling lines, et cetera, et cetera. There are, states that is, so I think there's a lot to learn just from within. And it's, just as the medical research community practically globally has just dropped everything in a sense and focused on understanding the disease, I think the research community in India and engaged with India should be sort of really mobilizing to understand, what's happening within India. What is it that we can learn from what's happening here? That's also likely to be more transmissible to other South Asian contexts. The East Asian context is really, really different. You can borrow some things, but the context is different. The system is different. Social systems are different. So I really would argue for, thoughtful analyses of, range of these different things, not just what health systems are doing, but also, what's the variability in how the social safety nets have been rolled out across different states and districts. What are we learning from there, et cetera. So really calling for like a big linked, research agenda that goes along, a learning agenda, not research for the sake of research, but research for the sake of quickly engaging with policy landscape.
So just on social safety nets, so I just want to discuss the relief program in more detail. So what was announced a few weeks back was a mix of cash transfers through existing programs and food aid through the public distribution system, but boosting them both up. Given limited resources that the government is working with, obviously limited fiscal space, do you think that the government has got the balance between cash and food right? So Farzana, why don't you go first, and then Purnima, you can weigh in.
Yeah, I mean, I think that as of yesterday, we don't know what the current package of the government is, which has been announced that will be 10% of the GDP. But what the existing cash transfers have been, they have been about, I think, 500 rupees per month to Jan Dhan accounts of women. And in terms of the PDS, there is, I think, a slight increase in I think Jean would have been kind of more aware of what the exact increase in the rations are under the PDS. But I think by all accounts, this is not sufficient. What the government had announced, and I was just following what the finance minister was discussing about the new package, in which there are, as of now, there is no indication of whether there will be any additional transfers going to households. Hopefully they'll come later, but 500 rupees per month is not anywhere near sufficient to meet the decline in incomes that these households are seeing. So for example, our, again, survey studies, and also there are a lot of these other ones, including ID Insight, I think the one that you referred to in the beginning, in the introduction. If the average earnings is about 380 rupees or 400 rupees per day, 90% of the population, for example, has not gone to work on a single day. They're going to have zero earnings, right? And then the ones which did, at least from the surveys that we have done, there is almost an 80% reduction in their earnings. So now if you think of 500 per month, it's peanuts, right? Because they are earning like on average about 300. Or you look at Manrega wages, right? So Manrega wages is going to be at least 250 or more than that in most states, right? And that's still below minimum wages in many states. So 500 rupees per month is nowhere near what is required in order to tide over this crisis. And in terms of the PDS, then there are, especially when one looks at migrants, then several migrants, or most of them, do not have ration cards when they come to urban areas. They're not able to access the system. So there is generally a consensus that there needs to be universalization or mobility allowed of these ration cards. And these are the times when one can think of how we can reform our this public security, providing these security measures, because we have a lot of variation across states. Most of these things, for example, the PDS, the Manrega, ensuring that everybody has Aadhaar cards, but Aadhaar cards also which are allows you to there are a lot of errors in the bank accounts details linked to these Aadhaars, as Jean would talk about, and he's mentioned today in his article in the Hindu. So there's no one particular strategy with which one could reach all the vulnerable sections of the population. It has to be a combination of cash and in-kind transfers. And I think this notion that we do not have the fiscal space is something that we should not think of, because these are extraordinary times and they require extraordinary measures. Until unless we stem this decline in incomes and the reduction in the complete halt in economic activity right now, we are probably staring at very reduced fiscal capacity even in the long run. So we have to be willing to bear a higher fiscal burden today so that we are able to grow tomorrow. And if you're not going to do that today, then our fiscal capacity is going to be constrained for a very, very long time.
Yeah, so if I can just comment on the social safety net. So there's been some work that colleagues of ours at IFPRI have been doing to kind of look at how states took on what the national guidance was and then adapted from there. And I think what you see is a lot of state variability. Some states just did what the national guidance was in the NFSA, and other states did a lot more top up and wherewithal. So it again speaks to issues of one, state capacity, but also just the ability of states to draw on their reserves, to mobilize resources for sort of adapted social safety nets, and to do so in ways that recognize that human beings, on a daily basis need maybe a little bit more than just rice. I mean, people need all kinds of things that go into making reasonable meals, even in difficult times. And so what you're seeing again is a range of different things that different states have done, not just in the basic NFSA kind of social safety nets, but also in the ways in which community kitchens have been rolled out, and the ways in which civil society was also engaged, encouraged, and supported. What we don't know is, I feel like there's a lot of, we're operating in the dark, and there's a lot of assumptions about the depth, about the breadth. We know it's big. We know some people have been affected very, very badly. We know a lot of people have been affected, but we don't, we don't have sort of the numbers to pin on that, because not all the surveys, for example, that people have done are all out in public domain. I thought, Farzana, the numbers that you shared on job losses and income losses seemed fairly well aligned with what NCAR had showed in their surveys, but those were also in urban Delhi. What is happening in other urban centers? What is happening to migrants as they move back? There needs to be sort of this consolidation of insights from all the different data sources that are available right now. And I think what we've seen in the in the last few weeks is that a lot of individual groups, people that did the surveys shared their different insights. But what we need at this point is a consolidation of the insights from all of these different data sources that help understand, what is the depth and the breadth and the ways in which people are feeling the pinch. It's one thing to say we are going to do something for the people, but it's really important we understand through this kind of data collection the ways in which people are feeling the pinch and the extent to which they're feeling the crisis, because then you can find the match that actually works. And I think that's going to be very context dependent. It's going to be different for the people, So again, I just feel like there's a lot of amazing work happening right now in the research community as well. But the consolidation of insight is just really, really critical at this point.
Yeah, if I can just say one thing, I totally agree with Purnima that there needs to be a consolidation of these various initiatives to collect data. There have been some recent initiatives also to collect data from migrants themselves. There's actually very little available for rural areas. And just one point that I wanted to add to that is that given that the situation is very dynamic, we can't depend on data at any one particular point of time.
Yeah.
This has to be a very, a continuous process where we are engaged and updating the data regularly. And that is the only way we can inform policy. Shahid?
Yeah. So just one practical question before we switch to audience Q&A. So you're mentioning consolidation of data, which is really important for kind of informed policymaking, understanding the depth and the breadth of the problem across the country, different geographies and so on. Who would take that on? Would the Indian government take on a research challenge like that? Are other institutions taking that on? I mean, it's a huge problem of coordination between different institutions as well. IFPRI might be doing some things, Niti Aayog might be doing some things, JPAL is doing some things, IGC is doing some things. And the data is very sporadic. It looks different in different areas. Questions are different. So do we have a kind of national strategy for collecting and understanding, analyzing data during this crisis?
If I may, I don't think a strategy exists, but to me, this is, precisely the kind of role that groups like Niti Aayog should be able to play. The ability to convene, the ability to bring people together, to connect the dots. Some of that has already been happening in the context of the aspirational districts programs, right? But it's been very focused on the ADP. And so there's been a lot of data coming in through ID Insight and other sources to inform the progress on the ADP itself, but this is now beyond that. So, I think what we have is we have a body, they have some processes that have been looking at least at some data sources and trying to, maybe it's been used more from an accountability perspective in the ADP, but the fact that there is a process by which data has come into the system, insights have been drawn from that, translated at least back to districts. But that now needs to be amplified, because it's not going to be enough to have data just on, n number of aspirational districts. I think what we're seeing is a crisis that's really cutting across. So, we need a different kind of process, and maybe it should be people working in partnership with groups like Niti. But I think, state governments and different state governments need to be doing the same thing, because at the end of the day, what happens within a state has to be driven by this, push-pull of the interactions what's coming down from the national analytic work or the national policy guidance, and what the state has the wherewithal to do. Because on a lot of these things, they're also state subjects, and the states have a lot of leeway in terms of what they do. But again, there are possibly states that have some good practices on things like this. So it's a question not just of the institution, but also identifying the right processes and bringing in a broad community of people to engage on this.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with what Purnima is saying. There has to be some nodal agency which would bring together these diverse groups. But there are also a non-research oriented, data collection that's possible. So for example, Google is doing these Google Maps which track movements at a very localized level. So there is geocoded data available, which will be, and similarly Facebook is doing that. And it was very interesting when you go online and you want to look at, for example, in the US, you'll be able to figure out at the county level how many people have gone for recreation or gone for shopping and so on and so forth. Now in India, where there are massive numbers of people who are potentially going to move from urban areas to rural areas, we need to understand where they are moving from, where they are moving to. And since the situation is so dynamic, these are the kinds of data sources that we need, along with these surveys, which will tell you what the impact has been. We also need to have data which maps on a continuous basis using these, at the grid level, for example, which is what Facebook would give you or Google would give you. And I'm wondering why we don't have any of that available for India. So you get these every 2 weeks or so. Google provides information on what it calls mobility data. Facebook mobility data for India, for example, is, you can access it as a researcher. You have to apply for that data. But this is something that is very simple for the government to do, because for the government right now, one of the questions that is coming out of Niti Aayog is what numbers should we expect in terms of people moving back to rural areas? Do rural areas have the capacity to absorb these? Which are the districts which would be receiving these migrants? What do we need to do in terms of providing safety nets there? What's going to happen to the, the demand in manufacturing units, in construction, in urban areas because of these movements? So all these questions, it requires not just individual researchers, but there's this technology now, these big data companies, for example, you have mobile phone companies which will be able to track people's movements. So keeping privacy concerns intact, of course, we don't want to, individualize any of this data. There is tremendous amount of information that is available out there that needs to be leveraged, and it hasn't been as yet.
Thanks both. Okay, so we're going to open it up to audience Q&A now. I'm getting a steady stream of questions on my chat window over here. I'd just like to thank all the participants for joining. We have more than 320 participants right now, and I'm getting a lot of good questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to ask a few of these questions. Some of them are to both of you, some of them are to Farzana, some of them are to Purnima, and I'll let you know which ones are which. So the first question is to both of you, and it's about Aadhaar. So Aadhaar is still mandatory for receiving benefits, but some evidence shows that the failure rate of the Aadhaar-enabled payment system is as high as 40%. How can we ensure that people receive cash transfers and rations in a universal way when there are obviously some problems with the so-called JAM Trinity? Farzana, you want to take that on?
Yeah, so I think one of the things, again, I think something that I referred to earlier is that we can't use any one particular mode in order to transfer these benefits to these groups. So for example, Manrega job cards would be, there would be a lot of holders of Manrega job cards, which are again linked to biometrics to their bank accounts, which can be used as substitutes for non-availability of Aadhaar or in place of Aadhaar. there's been discussions about using the public distribution system as also a point where they could function as ATMs where cash could be withdrawn and not just food. And then there is, there have been some recent suggestions also about, for example, using the SCCC survey, which of course is not perfect and it's pretty old now. It was done in 2011. But the SCCC survey, for example, was used for the Ujjwala program for making transfers to women's accounts under the LPG scheme. So one cannot rely on one particular avenue for ensuring that all those who are vulnerable are going to be able to get those transfers. And we might end up with making multiple transfers to one household, because a household which has an Aadhaar might also be in SCCC and might also have Manrega job cards. But I think it's an error that is worth taking, given that as of now, the amounts that the government has announced, which is like 500 rupees per month, is so minuscule. So I would not worry about, making multiple payments to one household, but using multiple avenues. And that includes both cash as well as in kind. And that's why I'm emphasizing again and again that it cannot be just cash. It also has to be in kind. And which is also what Purnima said, they don't just require cash. There are other, and as prices of food grains go up, as prices of essentials go up, because the supply chains are choked, you're not going to be able to, sustain yourselves on 500 rupees a month. So you do need these supplements in terms of food grains, free food grains, increase in rations, and everything else that is required for these people to survive.
Okay.
Yeah, I just want to agree with that and say that, this is perhaps not a time to worry about, positive inclusion errors, where, you include more people than you might. I think, one needs to worry because the extent of the distress that, one is hearing about, again, with the caveats that we don't necessarily have all the data, but if, people, just the fact that we know that the job losses have been so tremendous, most surveys that I've seen are definitely showing that it's better to err on the side of, including more people than to exclude those who are truly in distress. So whatever is happening, there's going to have to be a lot of local innovation and local adaptation to say, okay, we're just going to accept that it doesn't matter if Aadhaar fails or whatever happens. People who need help need to get help, and that freedom, in a sense, to adapt needs to be available at local levels. Again, I think we should be keeping a close eye on what are the kinds of things that states and districts are doing to, to support those in distress and sort of overcome some of these known challenges. So I'll just leave it at that, because I think Prasanna spoke to this quite extensively.
So there are lots of other people who have also asked questions similar to this one. I just want to say that, so Prerna Kundu from JPAL South Asia, for example, has asked, a lot of relief is being channeled through existing social security schemes. However, a lot of these suffer from exclusion. Given how severe the consequences of exclusion can be at this time, do you think that there is a need for relief work that does not rely on these existing structures and instead is more universal? And I think you've both spoken to that as well. So another question. So Digvijay Singh from UNDP asks, with the huge return of migration and uptake of Manrega has increased, what can the government do to match the increase in demand for Manrega? Nearly 40% of the Manrega funds have been utilized. Can increase in person days from 100 to 200 help the rural population cope with the COVID crisis? And should the government increase budget allocations for Manrega, which seems to be running short in the near future?
If I can speak to this, this is something that I really push for every time this comes up, which is, number one is budgetary allocations for Manrega have in real terms not actually increased in the last few years. So in nominal terms, they are more or less the same, but in real terms, they've probably actually declined maybe since 2014. The second is that the minimum wages under Manrega have not risen for quite a few years now. And so, of course, naturally, there would be less demand for Manrega work. But given these extraordinary circumstances and given that people have, absolutely no other avenues available for income, there's definitely, expected to be an increase in demand for Manrega work. And there are two things here. What has been the center's response, because there's a sharing of the burden of Manrega between the center and the state, but primarily the burden lies on the center. The center, unfortunately, has not increased the allocation. And the second issue is, even if there is allocation, one looks at utilization. The utilization in the last few years has been pretty poor and has been abysmal. So even if there has been demand for Manrega work, there have been no projects available for people to work on. So for example, now we see Rajasthan has done a tremendous job in terms of providing a shelf of works to people who are in distress due to the virus. So then this again speaks to what Purnima was saying, which is that we need, different states are responding differently, but I think Manrega has to be a critical element of the response that state governments have. And this is going to be more so critical for those states which have less capacity to absorb these migrants who are coming back. For example, Bihar, for example, Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh, which are most of the states where you see large numbers of people who migrate to urban areas. So definitely, yes, there should be an increase in allocation. There has to be, at the local level, improvements in utilization, and that requires some amount of political will to be able to do that, coupled with an increase in the minimum wages that come from Manrega work.
Yeah, I just want to put on the table that, we shouldn't forget, the issue of the urban poor and the lack of the, the sort of the equivalent social safety net for the urban poor is also something to really worry about, because not everyone who's, lost an income in urban areas is migrating back to rural areas. That's also, quite variable. So a lot of thought is needed on the social safety net, alongside all of the other work on the economic packages. And it requires sort of this nuanced understanding of what is the nature of distress, who is distressed in which parts of the country. One of the challenges with program design has been, there is a rural bias when you design a lot of these social safety net programs. And we are in a situation now where the crisis is both rural and urban, but in fact, we likely have a better mechanism for the rural because you have, at least the Manrega mechanism, and the changes that would need to be made there, whether it's in increasing the number of days or increasing the wages, these are somewhat easier than perhaps finding, what may need to be a different solution for, for the folks who are distressed in urban areas. So I think just some really serious thought on the range of social protection mechanisms that would be needed here is critical.
I just wanted to, have a minor, this is a minor disagreement with what Purnima is saying. I would not call it a rural bias. A large proportion of the people who move from rural areas to urban areas do so because there is a lack of opportunities for work. There is a lack of minimum wages. There is a huge amount of movement away from agriculture. And so if of course, and that's a big if we are able to stem this movement back from urban areas to rural areas, and most of these are seasonal migrants, and they go to urban areas during the off agricultural season because there's nothing to do in rural areas. But there's been tremendous amount of work trying to look at whether Manrega has reduced migration rates from rural areas to urban areas, and that was one of the initial objectives of the program. And so it is natural that since the poverty is much more endemic in rural areas, there would be a focus on these sorts of programs which would, address that issue. But of course, I totally agree with you that it has to be an effort that also looks at what's happening with the non-seasonal migrants, permanent migrants, and the urban poor. And for that, I think what is required is for business activity to start. And maybe I'm hopeful that the initiative that the government has taken in terms of providing loans and credit to the micro, small, and medium enterprises would be one way to go, because there's a large proportion of self-employed, informal sector workers in urban areas. A majority of our workers in urban areas are informally employed, and they are the ones who would need these small loans. But more importantly, if there isn't any demand, you're not going to see the cobbler on the roads, you're not going to see any petty shops opening. So if there is no cash transfer, there's no cash in the bank accounts of these of people in urban areas, there's not going to be any demand. So a demand stimulus is absolutely critical to whether we think in a rural context or we think in an urban context.
Okay, moving on to some other questions. This is voted as the most popular question out of everyone. To any panelist, with the recent diluting of labor laws in many states of India, how do you think it will impact migrant labor, and what can be done to protect their rights? Either of you can go with that.
Yeah, so I don't know, Hema, do you want to take that first? Or?
I'm not an expert in labor laws or anything at all, but it has been fairly astounding to see the dilution happening very quickly and very dramatically. So, I'm just going to sort of take my hat off to those people who I know are watching those laws really carefully and responding to those and thinking, about what the implications are. These are difficult times, and finding the balance is going to be really difficult. But workers' rights and protection of people who do difficult work in difficult circumstances, that has to be important. Farzana, I'm going to let you take that from there.
So I'm not an expert on labor laws, but I'm just trying to understand the reason why we are having these changes right now is because there's an expectation that there will be an exodus of firms, manufacturing units, possibly from China, and India is one destination that they may be looking at. That's number one. Number two is, if you want to restart economic activity, the states want to make it easy for the business owners to restart economic activity by allowing them to and given the fact that there is an expectation that there will be a crisis in terms of supply of labor, to be able to hire and fire. But so there's been this cry for labor reforms in terms of making it more easy for manufacturing units, for businesses to allow them to have contract labor, which allows the flexibility for businesses and potentially allows for greater innovation, productivity, growth, and all of that. But I think the way it is being done right now, one of the biggest issues would be that the workers are absolutely not left with any redressal mechanism. So if you, in some of the states, for example, in Madhya Pradesh, they have disallowed unions, which means that, there is no redressal mechanism if you lose a job, if you are injured grievously while at work. And so I think there needs to be a balance in terms of making sure that the interests of both parties, of both the employers as well as the employees, are balanced, rather than going for this other extreme. We've been asking for labor reforms for many, many years now, but I think this is an extreme reaction, and this needs to be tempered. But every state also has to make sure that it goes through the proper legislative procedure before these labor laws become truly laws, and these changes are become effective. And I think they will face some oppositions, and maybe this is just a very short run. I'm hoping that this is just something that they're doing in the short run to kickstart their economies, and this is not going to be the long-term scenario in terms of complete dilution of workers' rights and avenues to redressal of their concerns.
Okay, I'm going to ask a couple more questions and we can move back to a more general discussion. Question for Purnima. What challenges do you anticipate for nutrition programming run by the government, given the participatory nature of Poshan Abhiyan?
Yeah, actually huge challenges, and the nutrition community, the policy community is quite worried about this. It's taken a very long time for the acknowledgement of malnutrition as a major problem to sort of align on a package of solutions to identify the programs through which this is to be implemented. And so for those of us who work in nutrition, sort of the announcement and the anchoring of Poshan Abhiyan with the leadership of the Prime Minister was actually a very, very welcome move. And of course, it was it's really something that will be challenged in fairly dramatic ways looking ahead. At the same time, some of the things that were supposed to happen on Poshan Abhiyan are, very much around making your base health and nutrition programs, so health and ICDS, work effectively enough. And so there's been a lot of system level improvements to make that happen as well. We know there's a lot of innovation and adaptation happening on the ground around what's happening for Poshan Abhiyan already. We're trying to sort of gather, intelligence in a sense on, okay, what do those adaptations look like, and to what extent do they preserve some of what was supposed to happen under the umbrella of the program. But there's a lot of issues to be concerned about there. And of course, the economic hit on the families is a big concern for nutrition as well, because household food security, foods that are available in households are what reach the women and children who are the more vulnerable members of the household. So from a nutrition perspective, we're not just worried about what happens in the ICDS and, the health system that's delivering sort of the core of Poshan Abhiyan. We're also very worried about what's happening in the economy and what that's going to do to, households and their ability to respond to, for example, behavior change messages, or to be able to, mobilize resources to reach women and children in the first 1,000 days so that, diets improve and things like that. So, we're sort of trying to consolidate what we are concerned about and, raise the kinds of issues that need to be raised and discussed. We know the government is definitely thinking about this. It is a very important agenda. It's an agenda that affects human capital development for India, and it's an agenda that you don't want it to be derailed by something like COVID-19. But there's many different ways in which that can happen. So, yes, I'm very concerned, but I'm also, and the nutrition community itself is really quite energized and is working closely with the governments, including with state governments, to see what can be preserved and what cannot be. And if I may just say one more thing, I think what's interesting about this is that the fact that you had such a strong body of action happening on nutrition may actually help the nutrition agenda stay or at least come back to sort of center stage, or at least come back to not be so badly derailed. I worry a lot more about maybe some of the other big policy agendas where, you didn't have sort of this big energy pre-COVID, and that, those other issues may lose out, even as we move through the pandemic. But yeah, we're very concerned about India. I mean, every day, 80,000 mothers give birth every day. We worry about how they're being supported. You're on mute, Shahid.
Yeah, sorry. One last question, and then we'll move back to a quick discussion and wrap up. So Rex Joshua of DFID asks to any panelist, can we expect that there will be an increased demand for micro savings once the informal economy comes back to normal to protect from shocks like these? Is that an area the government and donor community should focus on?
Farzana, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think for sure. I think that's a very good question, and that is something that does need to be focused on. So again, as I mentioned earlier, almost by some accounts, 90% of our workforce is employed in the informal sector. Many of them run small businesses, petty businesses. And so I think getting microloans to them would be absolutely important and critical, especially if you look at, the financial system as it is currently in our country. There is almost no desire to, to give loans, given, this huge amount of bad loans that have piled up. Whatever we might do in terms of trying to reduce interest rates and encourage banks to lend. There are people who want to borrow, of course, but there is not enough lending that is happening through the formal banking channels. I think these microloans are going to be extremely important, especially for the MSMEs, which are the engines of our economy, which employ tons of people. And that is something that we should definitely look at going in the short run to, long run in terms of reviving the economy. I think that would be quite important.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so we're going to put Q&A to a halt for now. We'll just get back to a general discussion for maybe another 10, 15 minutes. And then I'll look through the questions again and see if there's anything interesting that can be asked. So to you both, what I'm getting from this discussion generally is that that India does have the capability in terms of the infrastructure, the ability to deliver on social protection, certainly more than what is being done right now, with food aid, with cash transfers, with wage subsidies, with free LPG cylinders, whatever it may be. Now, the real question is, what has kept the Indian government from offering more aid by way of transfers? We've talked a little bit about a fiscal deficit, but that should not be a concern right now in a time of huge crisis. Are there other kind of political economy issues at play? Because it's quite strange why a country that it may not have the fiscal resources of richer countries, but we certainly have a pretty decent infrastructure to deliver more. So the question is, what is holding India back from doing that? And I guess a caveat is we'll see what happens in the next few days once the announcements come through.
Sure, go ahead, Farzana, I'll go after you.
Go ahead, sorry.
No, I think this is where that, earlier issue I raised about anticipatory analysis, is there anyone who could have predicted how extensive the impact would be, how deep and how broad? Because if that could have been predicted, then I think the conversations around social safety nets could have gone along with that conversation, right? But what one saw was that, the way the dominoes fell, in a sense, was just so dramatic. It was really dramatic. It was heartbreaking. We still, like I said, we still don't know both the depth and the breadth of what the need is going to be around a social safety net. And it's not going to be restricted just to the very, very poor. What you're seeing in the economy means that there's going to be efforts needed to sort of protect and support way more people than one has potentially considered before. So we're still we're about 6 weeks into the lockdown itself, and a lot of the impacts that we're seeing are related very much to the lockdown. But I'm just hoping that all of this insight that is coming together from the work Farzana is doing, from the work NCAR is doing, from the work, I think there's about 25, 30 at least sets of basic research happening that is going to help characterize the extent and the depth of the need. What we have seen, is that certainly on, for example, on the health front and in some other, in some other areas, you've seen that government has been able to move quite fast. Whether sort of, okay, we need to move quickly on testing, we need to move quickly to set up certain things. And those were the early, very critical responses to the pandemic itself. What we need to see now is sort of informed, but also quick movement around the social safety net. The last thing you want is people dying of hunger. We don't want that. We want to protect the most vulnerable as quickly as we can, as efficiently as we can, and in ways that prevent what are some really dramatic consequences. And at the same time, you want to be thinking about what are the things you need to do in the medium and the long term. Because if there's one thing we're learning about this pandemic, it's certainly not listening to when the government decides the lockdown is lifted, right? I mean, if I were the virus, I'd be excited about the lockdown being lifted, because that means more prospect for viral transmission. But governments are going to be in this dance for a really long time, both on the health system side and on the social response side. So, it is going to have to be really dynamic what happens looking forward. I don't think one thing now is going to help. It's going to be a series of things that has to come as this unfolds. So I'm just going to leave that there, and really look forward to hearing what Farzana has to say about it.
Yeah, I agree with Purnima. I think the number one issue was at the beginning of the lockdown, at least, there was no assessment of what the needs are going to be, because we went into the lockdown pretty unprepared. We didn't know what's going. For example, even economists or sociologists, for that matter, would not have anticipated this potential movement of seasonal migrants from urban areas to rural areas. So, of course, there was lack of preparation, and so assessment of need was almost absent. But now we have, I think, a significant amount of body of evidence available, which will tell us that there is tremendous amount of need. Having said that, I think the number one issue is that the fiscal space of the central government is very limited. The fiscal space of the central government was limited even before the budget, before this crisis happened. There was a lot of discussion at the time of the budget itself that there needs to be a stimulus, particularly for the rural areas, which were seeing the lowest growth rates in agriculture and a lack of demand in rural areas. Now, of course, this has got compounded more because the revenues coming in from the government, both direct as well as indirect, have fallen tremendously as a result of the lockdown. And so recently, for example, the central government has announced an increase in borrowing by up to 50%. But most of that borrowing that they're going to do is going to be meet their existing the needs which are over and above the new ones which have cropped up as a result of the virus. So the number one thing is the central government's fiscal space is limited. So whenever we talk to, as economists, you've now had conversations with policymakers, despite the fact that, many leading economists have called for not worrying about the fiscal deficit. There is a tremendous concern within the government about the fiscal deficit and how much they can expand it. The second issue is a lot of the burden has been shifted on to the state governments, and post GST, the fiscal space of the state governments has been, even further limited. There have been, you must have, all of you must have come across all these articles which are coming in the newspapers where the state governments were demanding their share of the GST revenues, which hadn't been passed over in early March itself, which was much before the crisis happened. And the capacity of the state governments to borrow, where are they going to go to do the borrowing? Because a lot of these programs, these safety nets, Manrega, the PDS system, localization of these efforts, the need to trim these efforts to local needs, which are the public health system. All of this a huge chunk of this falls under the responsibility of the state governments, but the state governments are completely strapped for cash. So, so the concern really here is, there is very limited amount of money in the system. And basically the government now has to print money, which is that they have to borrow from the RBI and just say, okay, we're not going to care about the fiscal deficit. We're just going to print money and we are going to use that to tide over this crisis. And there might be a lack of political will to do that. Maybe that is too risky for this current political setup.
Yeah. So just on that point of state governments and its relationship with the center, what role do the state governments have to play in social protection more broadly? So I know that the PDS and Manrega, all of these things are implemented by state governments, but policy is set nationally mostly. But then different states also have their own kind of social safety net programs. Can you just talk a little bit about the variation across states within India and what role state governments generally do have to play with social protection?
Purnima, do you want to take that?
Sure, yeah. There is quite a lot of variation across the states in terms of how they approach social protection in general. Of course, the states are responding to the national guidance, and part of it is they have to be able to access the funding and all of that stuff. But states are also able to do more, and we've seen that even in the context of the responses that happen in the immediate post-lockdown period in terms of how they deployed different kinds of packages, even around the safety nets. But the fact of the matter is, at the end of the day, there's a certain set of sort of base social safety net program, and that base is predominantly linked to the centrally sponsored schemes and the National Food Security Act and stuff like that. And those are the base that reaches, the group that we are talking about here. And so, again, it's a great time to look at, how have states innovated around these national programs? Where have they managed to bring the resources in to kind of do top-ups or expansions, and the expansions are of different kinds. There's, expansions in terms of adding beneficiary groups. There's expansions in terms of adding, for example, commodities and foods into the food basket, topping up cash transfers, et cetera, but there's also innovations around how things are done. How do you make it easier for people to access their benefits? So this is a really good time to kind of bring some of that work together, to look at some of that. What worries me in some of this is the same thing that worries me around the health systems. States that have their sort of the governance of these and the implementation nuts and bolts of these programs will be able to move faster, expand and innovate more, reach people in distress more, whereas states that have been struggling around the basics of implementing, even sort of your base centrally sponsored schemes, that's where you're going to see a lot of distress. And so, that's not a program design issue necessarily, that's a basic nuts and bolts of state governance, capacity, and capability, state and district. So, a lot of stuff to keep our eyes on in terms of state variability and what works for whom, where, what is the kind of support that people can provide to remove some of the blockages, or support state governments even in streamlining implementation, etc. But it's a really difficult time, and you can't fix a difficult governance or implementation system at the same time that you're trying to sort of build surge capacity to deal with crisis. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. Okay, so I realize we've got 10 minutes to go. I'm going to ask one more question or a couple more questions. So in terms of, we talked a little bit about how the disease is perceived in India and how communications and information can play a role in kind of shifting the mindset. I know that people in India are are hooked onto WhatsApp. And there's a lot of fake news going around. Now, question to you both. Do you think that social media and misinformation have had an impact on the perceptions towards the disease?
I mean, I would just say it in one word, is absolutely.
Yeah.
Especially at the beginning, I think there's a better understanding, at least amongst the educated in urban areas, of what the disease is, how it spreads, what the fatality rates might be, who's more vulnerable and who's not. But what I really worry about is what is being, understood by those who are less educated in the rural areas, and a lot of the reactions that we are seeing amongst the less educated might be absolutely because of all this misinformation. And that's why, again, I want to underline what I said in the beginning, which is that there needs to be a concentrated, very well thought out public health information campaign, which needs to clear these misunderstandings, and really to convey the basic fact that the mortality rates are very, very low of this disease. It is easily communicable, but it is also, most people are going to recover from it. I think that is something that most people don't know. For example, even in our own houses, the helps that we have in our house will say, oh, ये तो बहुत ही भयानक disease सुना है, एकदम जान ले लेता है. Now, this is a basic misconception that needs to be allayed.
Purnima, thoughts on that?
Yeah, effective public health communication, if there were, is absolutely critical here. So I know that the health communication community is actually working really, really, really hard to kind of support the government and the ministry in sort of getting out more facts-based communication, etc. There are challenges with that. I mean, I think, as a health person, I disagree just a little bit with you, Farzana, that it's not an easy disease. It's not something that, yes, you'll recover, but, people are actually sick. It's not a flu in that you're sick for, say, 7 days. People, even those who have mild to moderate versions of it, are actually sick for long periods of time, 15, 20, sometimes even 30 days. There's just a lot we don't know about the clinical manifestations. What we do know is that people can get pretty sick from it, even if you recover at home. But people need to know more about that. What's difficult is that, unless you start to know people who actually get sick from it and recover, it's, even those of us who are reading up about all of it, there's nothing like these personal patient testimonials of our friends and other people who have gone through it in other places that kind of make certain things click for you in a different way. But I know that the health communications folks are trying to work really hard on this. But it is going to get weary. What people need to do to protect themselves from the virus is going to get difficult for people, because human beings can't live like this forever. So keeping up the public health communications has to be a big, big, big part of it. One of the interesting things that I learned about that China was doing apparently a lot of listening. So I heard a talk from UNICEF China recently where they said they were doing a lot of listening to what kinds of things people were worried about, and then tailoring and connecting the health communications back to the kinds of concerns that people were raising. I think, again, in India, with the kind of digital connectivity that exists, it is going to be possible. And it is really important that, it isn't just a one-way communication, but that there is enough listening to say, what are people understanding about this? How are they reacting to the public messages? How can we, support people with, Q&A kind of things, etc. So it's not a disease to trifle about, and so we need to really ramp up on that. But again, there's a lot of good people working on health comms who are supporting and working with the government on this. So I think we'll probably see more on this in coming days and weeks.
Yeah, no, all good points. I mean, I do think that you're right. It's not a disease to be trifled with, but I also do think that there's a disparity between what the disease probably is and what people think it to be.
Probably.
Yeah. Okay, we've got about 5 minutes to go. I'm going to wrap up with one final question to both of you. So, I mean, I think that we've seen a fairly muddled policy response to the crisis, to be frank, but same as other countries. Like both of you have said, it was very, very difficult to kind of predict the course of the disease. Very, very difficult to design policy responses in a situation like that. I mean, unfortunately, the social policy response has probably excluded millions and millions of people. Yet, there was a looming health crisis that could result in hundreds of thousands of cases and deaths on the other side as well. So you're kind of balancing lives and livelihoods, as they say. And it's a kind of damn if you do, damn if you don't situation, right? So India, like all countries, was in a bind and had to make some very hard decisions. To each of you, what do you think should be the core principles that governments should adhere to when crafting policy responses, especially in a time of crisis? Farzana, you want to take a shot?
So core principles of any government, is that what you're asking? Yeah, I think if we just kind of summarize what we said in the beginning, this is unprecedented. So it's hard to kind of say what the core principles should be. But yes, if I think preparation, anticipation is important in terms of planning what the next step should be. And there has to be learning at every level, which I think we've been slow at, despite the fact that there is tremendous amount of information coming in on, the impact of the shutdown, on our understanding of how this disease, how this virus travels and what impacts it has. We have not been adapting ourselves quickly enough, or learning from it quickly enough, and reacting fast enough to be able to address these issues. So as an economist, from that perspective, we are still to date trying to, or rather waiting for the government to provide sufficient social protection to these vulnerable groups. So just to give you an example, when the lockdown happened, and then there were a few bureaucrats who decided that, yes, we should allow buses to take the migrants back home. Those bureaucrats, for example, were transferred. This happened in Delhi. Now, 2 weeks down the line, we're doing precisely that. So I think what is required is preparation, but also at the same time continuous learning, because this is a dynamic situation. And number 3 is that the priority of any government should be to ensure that the most vulnerable are protected. And I don't think we've got there as yet in India. I still think we are not doing enough to make sure that people don't go hungry and that millions of people don't get pushed back into poverty, as a result of this shock, and because this will have longer term implications.
Yeah, so I really want to echo that principle. And, in a sense, I think that principle of thinking about the people who are the most vulnerable and most likely to be affected, whether it's by the health consequences or the social consequences, that principle comes from India. That is Gandhi's talisman, right? And so I think for me, the crisis, I really disagree with anyone who says that the virus affects us all equally. It really doesn't. It's a very, very stark reminder of the existing inequities, of the existing fragmentation, of the fragility of life and livelihood for so many. And in a sense, what it's done is it has sort of amplified what I think many of us who work in the social sector already knew was there. So it's really amplified that. And in a sense, then the only thing you can do is to acknowledge that this is still a society which is, deeply riven, where people are really, often in dire straits in normal circumstances. And so, applying that principle of, what is the impact of what I do on those who are most vulnerable? And I would add, women and children to the most vulnerable, because let's not forget that there's just been, education, what is happening on that, right? There's just sort of, so I think holding that principle will really help us think about social policy with, sort of embedding in that learning dynamism is going to be really important. And we can't assume that we know what solutions are going to work, which is why I think the learning component has to really walk hand in hand with whatever governments will have to keep doing. This is not going to be a one-off announcement of packages or transformation of programs or anything. It's going to be a long haul.
Yeah, agreed. Well, let's wrap up. A huge thank you to our speakers, Farzana Afridi, Purnima Menon. A pity that John Dress couldn't join us due to technical difficulties. He's in Ranchi right now, and I've been getting messages from my colleagues saying that there's a power cut as well, so he's sitting in the dark, unfortunately. So a very informative discussion. Thank you both. Really brought to light the enormity of the problem and the enormous challenges that lie ahead. Of course, the most vulnerable are not being protected right now. I'd just like to end with some optimistic messages. I think that we're, almost more than 2 months into the crisis now. Government is always reactive, not proactive, but I'm hoping that these 2 months have taught us a lot. We've got so much more information now about the people who are vulnerable, the people who need help. We know more about the virus as well, the transmission rates about the virus. India is a country that has a rich tradition of academia and of academia working closely with government as well. So I'm hoping that government is listening to people like you both, and that organizations like ISI, IGC, and IFPRI are being heard by people in the government. So I'm optimistic that we'll come out of this despite huge loss in economic and economic life. So anyway, thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shahid.
Thank you for having us.